Well, good morning. I just learned how to do a fancy countdown. That's pretty exciting. Um, we're just learning how to do all of this stuff just as we go. I am so glad that you could join me here this morning for our deep dive. We have been diving deep into the meaning of the season of Epiphany, because it's not just one day, it's an entire season where we talk about the manifestation of Christ into the world. And so here we are today, and we are going to be looking at the Gospel of Mark today. So last week we talked about how Jesus begins his public ministry in the Gospel of John with the miracle at Cana. In Mark, however, that public ministry begins in Capernaum with the teaching in the synagogue, in the casting out of a demon. So we find the story in Mark 1, verses 21 through 28, and it reads, "They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, 'What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God.' But Jesus rebuked him, saying, 'Be silent and come out of him.' And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, 'What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him.' And once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee." So the thing that really sticks out to me when I read this scripture is that the people were astounded because Jesus was teaching, as the quote is, one having authority and not like the scribes. It sticks out to me because I'm like, what does this even mean, right? So in Mark's view, Jesus's main adversaries in Galilee were scribes, although in Matthew we see that as Pharisees, right? In the first century, scribes and Pharisees were two largely distinct groups, though presumably there were probably some scribes who were Pharisees. Pre-destruction of the temple, so pre-79 CE, the Jewish community wasn't divided into their various factions in such a way that Mark, writing to a largely unified Jewish population, would have felt the need to call out a specific school, right? A specific sect. Instead, for the Markan community, scribes would have been the representatives of religious power. So why then, from Mark to Matthew, does the antagonist of Jesus change, right? So I want you to think, go with me on this, all right? So run with me here. I want you to think about superhero stories, like whether you want to talk about Marvel or DC Comics, whatever universe you prefer, but superhero stories, right? When we think about the arc of those stories and how who serves as the villain in those stories, we really see something very interesting. Superhero stories, although they'd occurred, they existed before World War II, really came of age during World War II. And the main adversary for most superheroes during this time were Nazis, although it switches a little bit to the Pacific after the victory in Europe. But as the US then shifts, right, into the Cold War, Soviet communism becomes the focal point of these superhero stories. In our current post-Cold War, post-modern superhero universe, villains can really run the gamut, right? They can be found, corporate corrupt corporate moguls, or a blend of all of history's villains, which I think we find in Hydra, right? So the shifts in storytelling here, my point, there's a point to this, I promise. The shifts in storytelling that happen because we want the readers present to always connect with the present in the story. When Matthew and Luke interpret the gospel story for their communities, they use references that would appeal to their communities, which is going to be different than the appeal that Mark is going to use for the Markan community. And this happens because of the destruction of the temple and because of the disunification, basically, that happens within the Jewish faith communities. So when you read Mark and you see scribes, or you read Matthew and you see Pharisees, you should read here religious elite, or even more pointedly, perhaps, dominant religious tradition, because that's really what we see here. So who were the scribes in Mark's day? Well, the scribes had a knowledge of law, and they could draft legal documents. So things like contracts for marriage, divorce, loans, inheritances, the sale of land, things like that. And every village had at least one scribe. And they're called the sophers, or the sopharim, right? Them together would be the sopharim. And this sort of community of scribes disappears somewhere around the second century BC. And the New Testament references to scribes really come into play as sort of doctors of law, or maybe even the jurists, right? Also sometimes called hakahim. And these are the ones who give legal advice to judges entrusted with the administration of the law. They found their way into the ranks of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they served in the Sanhedrin of Jerusalem, which was the chief legislative and judicial body from about 200 BC to AD or CE 70, when the Roman legions destroyed the temple of Jerusalem. So the way the scribes worked is they only really kind of told what the rabbis or doctors taught. They were the writers of the law, and their business was to transcribe the text of the Holy Scripture and to preserve it and to expound upon it. They admitted the authority of teachers higher than who they were themselves, and they often they did pay deference to them. So in their advice, they would appeal to the authority of this rabbi or that rabbi. So think about how legal cases work today, right? Often when a case is being argued, it's being argued on precedent. So for instance, Brown versus Board of Education, or you would hear something say, well, the court said this, or Miranda versus Arizona, the court said that. So scribes and later Pharisees served as like paralegals. They knew the law and the various interpretations of the law, so they could help administer the law and inform others about the law. In the synagogue, then they might talk about how Hillel the elder said X and Y, but to the same point, Simeon ben Hillel said Z, right? And so people were accustomed to hearing their teachers appeal to the wisdom of other people. So think about this, right? Then we even think, let's dive even deeper. Let's go beyond just the scribes and how people were taught, right? Let's think about the prophets. When the prophets are speaking to people, they're also appealing to somebody, to authority outside of themselves, right? In this case, God. So in the prophets, you're going to hear a lot, thus said the Lord. And that appears all the time because the prophets aren't saying, I'm telling you this. The prophets are saying, the Lord is speaking through me to you, right? So when Jesus begins to teach in the synagogue, he doesn't do this. Instead, he says to the followers, he says things like, verily, I say to you. When he does this, it's not just a throwaway phrase. He's claiming his divine authority as the Word of God manifested into the world as in a human form. So the very form of Jesus's teaching is shocking to people who are hearing it for the first time. It doesn't seem shocking to us. We read the verily as I say unto you, or as I have said to you, right? We read those and I think we're not as scandalized by them. But it was scandalous to have somebody teaching who wasn't appealing to either the authority of a rabbi or a doctor or to even God, but to speak as if they themselves were the word and the truth. So it's shocking. It's just shocking to them. So what, but it goes even further than that, right? Because Jesus isn't just talking about anything, he's talking about the law. When by this time, right, Jewish law incorporates both the laws of Moses and the laws that have developed through tradition. Okay, so we see lots and lots and lots of laws, and in fact, in the New Testament, we find Jesus referencing these laws. He calls them the laws of man. Time and time again, Jesus tells the teachers and the people that the laws that were developed by men are confusing them and that they're spending too much time worrying about these tiny little laws that they've forgotten the way of God. It's why Jesus distills all of the law into just two laws for people: love God and love your neighbor. This teaching is radical. This teaching is shocking and it's breathtaking. And so when we say that the people were astounded by this, that word astounded here, it means shocked. It means to be so amazed by something that you almost can't catch your breath. So the people are trying to figure out what it is and who it is that they're hearing. So the thing is, in Mark, the people, they rarely know who Jesus is. But time and time again, the demons know exactly who this person is. Have you ever noticed that? Like when you read Mark, have you ever noticed that? I want you to take some time after worship today. Go back through Mark. We've talked before about how the disciples in Mark, well, they come across as being a little bit lost in the sauce. They struggle to really understand who Jesus is and the implications Jesus has for them. And really for anyone. And they don't really get what's going on, even when Jesus is relatively straightforward with them. The average everyday people then are also pretty lost in the sauce. They really like Jesus's miracles and they'll flock to see him and maybe even listen to him. But if you were to take a poll on the ground of the people who had gathered the crowd around Jesus, very few of them would say that Jesus was the Messiah. And then we have the scribes, right? Or the religious officials generally. They're the most confused of the confused. They don't know who Jesus is at all. Why? Well, more than a few times we hear from Jesus that it's because they're so focused on the trees that they lose sight of the forest. But in the Gospel of Mark, the demons know exactly who Jesus is. And that's what we get in this short story. As Jesus is teaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath, one of the demons recognizes the power of God in Jesus and cries out, what to us and to you, Jesus of Nazareth? Wait, what? I mean, was that even English? If you read the NRSV or the NIV, then you see the question rendered, what have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? But if you happen to pick up a King James translation, one of the various forms of the King James translation, you'll find, let us alone, added to the start of that question. The literal Greek here is what to us and to you. And that's really hard to figure out in any form of intelligible English. First, because there's no verb. Second, you guys, there's no verb in this. So what is going on in this phrase, crazy Greek language? Well, in classical Greek, this phrase would mean something like, What do we have in common, right? But that's not really what's happening here. Instead, this is a literal transposition of a Hebrew idiom into Greek. And if you've ever studied a language, you know that the hardest thing to understand are the idioms. So Hebrew is like a language of just idioms sometimes it feels like. And so most of those, when they're then translated over into Greek, well, they're just translated literally. So, in order to better understand what this demon is saying here, and really what the demons say generally, because this comes up again every time a demon meets Jesus, we really need to go back to the Hebrew Bible and sort of figure out what's being said, because it turns out that this idiom, it's used a lot. So, just a couple of instances. In Second Chronicles chapter 35, verses 20 through 21, the king of Egypt is addressing Josiah, who is attacking him without being provoked. And the king says to him, "What to you and to me?" And the sense here is very clearly, what do you want with me? Why won't you just leave me in peace? And in First Kings 17, chapter 17, verse 18, the widow who is hosting Elijah is so upset with him, and rightly so in some ways. And she's blaming him because during his stay at her house, her son died. And she thinks it's happened because of him. The sense of the widow's question is, what do you want with me? Why are you here? Why did you come to me for my ruin? Leave me in peace. So in Hebrew, generally, this expression is used by people for one reason or another, wish to be left in peace. In this instance, then, the King James Version translations, well, they preserve the real sense of what the demon is saying here. The demon recognizes Jesus, saying, "I know who you are, the Holy One of God." The Holy One of God means a Messiah. And the demon asks Jesus rhetorically, "Have you come here to destroy us?" The demon knows exactly that Jesus has come here to liberate the world from the power of the evil and sin in the world. And he says to Jesus, "Leave me alone." And then in the first public ministry of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus tells the demon to be silent. The command is not just any old command, though. Jesus uses the same verb form here for be silent that we use in the Lord's Prayer when we ask God, when we entreat God to forgive us of our trespasses. Jesus tells him to begin being silent right now, but to remain silent for the rest of eternity. If you want to know what this verb form is called, it's called the ingressive aorist. And I think it's like the coolest verb tense ever. But still, that's what's happening here. Then Jesus says to him, come out of him. And because the power of evil is strong, but God has authority and power over evil, the demon does exactly what Jesus commands it to do. And we're told then that people are amazed by this. They connect Jesus's authority over this demon with the authority with which he was previously teaching them. Their amazement, though, the word amazement in English here lacks this depth, okay? It's not this benign amazement. The Greek word here is being amazed to the point of almost being terrified. The word encompasses both a sense of wonder and a deep sense of terror. And I think it's a highly appropriate word. I mean, imagine if you were in the synagogue and witnessed this happening. What would your reaction be, right? I mean, watching a man convulse and then scream out would probably strike you with a little bit of terror too. And because of this first miracle in Capernaum, Mark tells us that at once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. I think the translation of the word fame here is weird. The word used here literally means the sense of hearing, like as in one of the five senses. But it could also mean like the thing that you hear, right? So it could be news or report, or even more properly here, probably rumors. Maybe when being someone who rumors circulate about, maybe that's like fame, I guess, but it's not really a good kind of fame. The people, they're not sure what to make of Jesus. And so they talk about him with this kind of unsureness, right? They think that what he's doing is really kind of cool, but it's also really kind of scary too. They have a, like what I call a little bit of rubbernecker syndrome. They're fascinated by Jesus, but they also don't really want to look because it scares them too. So last week we looked at the miracle at Cana in the Gospel of John, which is how Jesus begins his public ministry in the Gospel of John. And today we looked at the first miracle that occurs in the Gospel of Mark, which is how Jesus begins his public ministry here. Next week, we're going to look at what Jesus says about his public ministry in the Gospel of Luke. And as we're doing this, I really want you to think about, what does it mean that the manifestation of Jesus in the world, in the Gospel of Mark, focuses on the casting out of a demon? What does this tell us about the kind of Messiah that Jesus is? And what does it tell us about God's power in the world? I think it lays out for us this power of God. So often we forget that God is more powerful than evil, and that God can easily win over evil, but we as humanity rarely give God that chance. So often we don't recognize who God is among us. We might be amazed by what we experience, but that amazement doesn't often translate into action. Or maybe it's that we're amazed because or maybe it's that we're not even amazed, right? Because we're like the scribes in Mark's gospel and we can't see the forest for the trees. Even when God is in the middle of us, speaking to us directly, we care more by whose authority God is acting than the fact that God is the authority for acting. I mean, if the demons can recognize God, why can't we? Well, join me next week when we look at what happens when Jesus goes back to his hometown, because there is some interesting stuff that happens there. Good morning to y'all. I can't wait to have you join us in worship, and I'll see you over on the YouTube or Facebook for our worship service in just a few minutes. Have a great day and enjoy the snow. Bye.